All right, Professor. Professor Peter Lewis is the Warren Weinstein Chair of African Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He served as SAIS Associate Dean for Academic and Faculty Affairs from 2015 to 2018 and has directed the school's Africa Studies program since joining Johns Hopkins University in 2006, and he currently oversees the school's Middle East program. His research and teaching focuses on economic reform and political transition in developing countries, with a particular emphasis on governance and development in sub-Saharan Africa. He has written extensively on economic adjustment, democratization, and civil society in Africa, democratic reform and political economy in Nigeria, public attitudes towards reform and democracy in West Africa. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the editorial board of the Journal of Democracy. He has consulted for the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the CARTEL Center, the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, and the World Bank. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of California in Berkeley and a master's and doctorate degrees from Princeton University. Ladies and gentlemen, please get your pens and papers as we listen to Professor Lewis. Your hands together for him again.
Political choice, and in providing options for negotiations and compromise. The world's strongest democracies are also among the world's most stable countries. Other large federal democracies have seen episodes of conflict resolution and greater stability after grappling with their own periods of intense unrest. India had a great deal of turbulence in the 1980s and 90s from insurgencies, political violence, and regional clashes, religious clashes, yet violence has been trending downward in India steadily for 25 years. Indonesia had a huge upsurge in conflict, a secessionist movement, and terrorist challenges at the time of their 1999 transition, the same year as Nigeria. Yet within a few years, they had achieved much greater stability. South Africa experienced intense political violence during the time of the 1994 transition, yet conflict subsided rapidly after the founding elections that brought Nelson Mandela to office. In Nigeria, we have seen instead an escalation and widening of violence across the country. And I'm just going to review what is probably very clear in most people's minds, but we should recall how these things have unfolded. Consider the key episodes of insecurity over the past decades. At the time of the political transition, we had a flurry of local conflicts in Lagos and Kano, Kaduna, Shagamu, Ile-Ife, Modekeke, Kafanchan, and other spots. When governors in the northern states expanded Sharia codes in many of the 12 of the northern states, we saw religious tensions escalate. Then beginning around 2004, we began to see an insurgency in the Niger Delta with the Niger Delta People's Volunteer Force and then the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta. This was contained through an offensive and through an amnesty in 2009, but at exactly the same moment, unfortunately, we began to see an upsurge in violence in the north with Boko Haram. And that has been complicated by the emergence of the Islamic State West African province. Then, after 2016, we see an escalation of the herder-farmer conflicts. At about the same time, there is a revival of the New Biafra movement, and there is violence in the eastern states. And now, certainly since 2016, 2017, we see growing criminality and banditry across the country. So it's useful to think again, just remind ourselves how these things have unfolded in different phases and different places. So the question then becomes for us, how do we account for this history? Violence and conflict in Nigeria are not driven by a single group. They're not driven by a single grievance, a core division, or a simple underlying problem such as poverty and resources. There are many different types of instability unfolding around the country. So we need to think that perhaps there is a more general problem of political inclusion, government legitimacy, and economic attainment for large parts of the population. The problem of security in the Fourth Republic is a problem of democratic incorporation and state performance. Oops. There we go. So I want to make 3 quick points and then conclude, because when the speaker says to conclude, this is everybody's favorite part of the speech. But I do want to make these 3 points quickly. First, the nature of the elite democratic bargain in the Fourth Republic has worked against broader representation across the Federation. Secondly, this same bargain has not fostered adequate economic development and broad-based economic growth, what we generally call shared prosperity. There is a severe democratic deficit in economic development in the Fourth Republic. And third, a divided elite and a marginalized population have turned too often to violent tactics in the struggle for resources and for identity. So let me quickly review each of these points. The Fourth Republic represents an historic bargain. Recall the 3 grand bargains in Nigerian history. The first was the independence bargain of 1959. It led to the First Republic in the current system. And indeed, the parties are often transactional, as politicians compete over the distribution of rents and spoils. Political parties do not project clear ideologies or party programs. As a result, the parties do not have strong voter coalitions beyond their regional support. This gives rise to a crucial problem of exclusion. For many groups at the political margins in Nigeria, they don't have a voice through the party system or through elections to the political establishment. They don't have access to power or policy. Without fair elections, accountable legislators, or responsive party organizations, substantial groups of citizens experience political disaffection. Electoral violence and low turnout are just 2 symptoms of this syndrome. This leads to a second problem. The first is some of the political problems that arise from the compact of the Fourth Republic, but also the failure of development, or the shortcomings of development should be noted. There is in the current political dispensation a type of what I will call an elite cartel that shares government resources and rents, but it works at cross purposes with economic development. And here I want to acknowledge a long lineage of scholars and analysts who have pointed to the problem of political capture, the problem of political logic working at cross purposes with development. There's Richard Joseph and the emphasis on pre-Bendel politics, the late Professor Claude Ake, who has argued that there is a political logic that diverges from development. My own work on the comparison between some Southeast Asian countries and Nigeria that looks at the possibility of a developmental ethos in countries that are diverse, some countries that have a Muslim majority, some countries that have problems with corruption, but the possibility of development in difficult territory, and difficult circumstances. Professor Utomi's many writings, but particularly his book, his recent memoir, Why Not?, which really reflects about political capture and elite politics in Nigeria. Zainab Usman's observations about political settlements and the nature of the political settlement working at cross purposes with development, and the Professor Omano Edigeji's important book, Democracy Without Development in Nigeria. Each of these authors has raised a central dilemma: the lack of a core bargain around development and broad-based prosperity. Pardon me, broad-based prosperity. I can pronounce that. Which, as Stefan Durkin reminds us, is a crucial foundation for political change. So the simple takeaway point here is that Nigeria's shortcomings in economic development represent a core political problem. A core problem of the political class, that the way it functions as a whole. Even with the many good people in this room who have made impressive efforts to advance Nigeria, we know that as a class and as a grouping, the political elite has not delivered. Let's recall that the Fourth Republic followed an extremely pernicious era of military rule that led to economic stagnation, global isolation, and yes, that's what I want, and a sharp rise in poverty. Some of those issues improved quickly under civilian rule. There was definitely an inflection point and a significant improvement after the dark years of the Abacha dictatorship and the arrival of a democratic dispensation. And it improved even more with the arrival of a new petroleum windfall in 2002, which opened dramatic possibilities for growth and diversification. And indeed, for a time, the country did see a reduction in external debt. It did see rapid economic growth, diminishing rates of poverty, expansion of non-oil activities in finance, in telecommunications, information technologies, media, entertainment, and we know that today Nigeria structurally, on paper, is no longer an oil economy in terms of relative output. We know that finance and ICT produce more in Nigeria in terms of national output than oil and gas. But the country still operates, obviously, in a political economy of oil and gas, which is very central to the operations of the state. And indeed, let's look to the larger truths. Because of population growth, there are more across the country. And economic transition to manufacturing and greater rural productivity still eludes Nigeria. And of course, we've seen that after the upsurge of economic growth with the last oil windfall, we see a rapid increase in GDP per capita in the early 2000s, but then that has come down and it turned negative during the post-2015 era because of lower oil prices and weaker oil markets. Coming back just a little bit now, but still not where it was earlier in the decade. Finally, we come to the problem of stability. Let me just make one more point about the economy, that the economic downturn of the last decade has not only reduced incomes, but that government has been unable to make critical investment in infrastructure. And we know that one of the elements, without going through the full menu of problems that are familiar to many people, one of the elements is the crucial bottleneck, the binding constraint of energy, of electricity. This is the hindrance to Nigeria's forward advancement. And when other countries have unlocked this problem, the economy moves. It is the binding constraint on the Nigerian economy, and all we have seen in the last 25 years is plans, misallocated funds, and low delivery. So this is a crucial problem. So economic marginality, the low gains of economic growth has overlapped with this problem of political exclusion to fuel the sources of violence. And here we see from some World Bank figures an indicator that they used for political stability and absence of violence or terrorism. And all that this should show us is that during the Second Republic, Nigeria has remained in very low percentiles. Now, everybody here has taken a standardized exam to gain entry to school. So we know that a low percentile is not good. You want to be in the upper percentile in any relative scale. And here Nigeria has gone between 9, 7, 2, consistently low, and at the very last section, I just want to give you the contrast with where a couple of other countries stand. So Ghana is currently in around the 40th percentile. Botswana is about the 87th percentile of all countries globally. And this is where Nigeria is. So we see the security challenge. We see the security deficit. And here there are two forces at work with regard to security. One is an elite problem and one is a grassroots problem. Nigeria's political class has encouraged significant drivers of violence. It's not universal, but it's common enough to be a problem. We see polarizing rhetoric. We see a variety of laws on indigenes and land use and other domains that divide communities. And in addition, many politicians or political aspirants have turned to violence in elections and collusion with armed groups in the search for power. Again, it may be a minority issue within political aspirants, but it is common enough to exert substantial effects. At the mass level, turning away from the elites, we see at the grassroots, in outlying regions or in areas with sharp divisions, many people have turned to violent mobilization to press their claims. This may be influenced by the tactics of politicians, but it also reflects the efforts of community entrepreneurs with a variety among the political establishment, can shift the current status quo. In recent elections, including the last election, we have seen articulate, development-oriented candidates. Professor Utomi was such a candidate in earlier elections. We also see some governors and ministers associated with the major parties who embody a stronger commitment to governance and economic change. If a major party or influential challenger builds a policy platform that attracts voters and embodies a programmatic approach to politics, as Eddie Geji reminds us, this could serve as a vehicle for transition. Such tendencies and individuals are already visible in the Nigerian landscape, and the challenge is organization building and political mobilization. Institution building is critical, and reform in the security sector. I see stirrings in my hosts, and so I realize I've spoken over my time. So let me conclude with a simple observation. In 1999, India looked very much like Nigeria does today. There were secessionist movements, breakaway factions, big insurgencies, widespread crime, religious riots, even political assassinations of the head of state. Since the turn of this century, everything in India in terms of stability has been trending in a good direction. Violence has been going down. This resulted from broad-based economic growth, one of the fastest per capita increases in growth in anywhere in the world. Nigeria, unfortunately, has overtaken India as the poverty capital of the world in terms of sheer numbers. It was careful conflict resolution by politicians, broad-based political parties that spoke to large numbers of people and delivered some sense of hope to the voting masses, and an elite compact around growth. Also, some capability in the security service. The point is that if it can happen in India or Indonesia or South Africa, it can happen here. So India's example should remind us that in a federal democracy with many divisions, lots of poverty, and a difficult history, we can get rapid improvements. The options awaiting Nigeria should inspire us all. Thank you for your time.
For updates.